Welcome. I think we have all of our panelists with us, and as people are filing still into our panel discussion, let me just start with a few words of introduction. So my name is Mariana Bujarin. I'm a research associate with the Project on Managing the Atom here at the Harvard Kennedy School, Belfer Center. And I welcome welcome everyone to a panel discussion titled Pipelines and Ceilings: The Gender Gap in Nuclear Policy. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers today, women who are not only accomplished nuclear experts in their own right, and national security experts, but who have also engaged in significant and meaningful ways in promoting gender diversity in the field. So I am incredibly honored to be moderating this discussion today, and simply to be in the company, although albeit virtual, unfortunately, of such incredible women. Before I introduce our speakers, allow me to share a few words of background about this MTA series, which we titled Atomic Voices, and of which this panel is a part. So the impetus for the series came from the national and international reckoning with the systemic racial injustice and the widespread protests in the summer of 2020, which prompted many institutions, including Harvard and the Belfer Center and MTA, to take a hard and rather uncomfortable look at our own diversity policies and begin revamping them. At the same time, a group of 5 authors, all of them incidentally women, including women of color, and 3 of which were MTA fellows or former fellows, published an article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist calling for racial action and accountability in the US nuclear community. A group of MTA fellows then decided to take this further and organize a series of panels to broach discussions on diversity and inclusion in our field and provide a forum for voices and for perspectives that are perhaps undeservedly marginalized. So last year, we held 3 such panels on racial injustice in the nuclear field, on the impact of uranium mining on indigenous communities in Southwestern United States, and on Africa's role in the global nuclear order. I would like to give a shout out to my former and current colleagues at MTA who have contributed to this effort: Danya Jokic, Rebecca Gibbons, Stephen Herzog, Aditi Verma, Ruhi Niog, and Melis Marjan. Today's panel opens the series for this academic year with a discussion of a set of challenges that are pretty much as old as the nuclear field itself, namely the deplorable lack of diversity in the national security and nuclear fields in particular. So while some advances have been achieved in bringing more women per se into the field over the past couple of decades, the situation remains bleak for people of color and minorities. We're going to focus today specifically on the gender gap, on the challenges women face in entering the field and in remaining in the field and working in the field. For even if access for women has improved, women are still entering spaces that were not shaped by women, and in which certain traits and certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of expertise get rewarded and others are penalized. So what we're going to try and unpack today is not merely how to improve the statistics and the optics of the field, but to understand what the female experience is like and how women navigate the existing hierarchies and structures of power, and what transformative effects, if any, and what new perspectives greater diversity can bring to the nuclear field. Before we proceed with this important discussion, let me mention just a few housekeeping rules. Our session is recorded and it will be available later on our website. None of the content of this webinar can be reproduced literally or quoted directly without prior consultations with us. And since we're really hoping for a lively and robust discussion, we encourage you to use the Q&A function to post your questions, which I will then relate to the speakers. And you're welcome to do so at any time during the presentation. So without further ado, let me briefly introduce the 5 exceptional women that join us today. And you will find their full biographies on the website, on the site of the event. We have with us today Sarah Bidgood, and she is the director of the Eurasia Nonproliferation Program at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies at Monterey. She is also an adjunct professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in the Nonproliferation Terrorism Studies MA program. Her research focuses on US-Soviet and US-Russian nonproliferation and arms control cooperation, as well as the nonproliferation regime more broadly. She is a widely published author and commentator on nonproliferation and nuclear policy issues. She also leads the Young Women in Nonproliferation initiative at CNS and works with undergraduate women to increase interest and facilitate their access to the nuclear field. Heather Herlbert is the director of the New Model of Policy Change project with New America Foundation's Political Reform Program. Heather leads research in the effectiveness of policy advocacy in the current environment of intense political polarization and works with advocates and funders seeking to navigate politics effectively on issues such as national security and climate change. Heather is a prolific commentator in news media, and she also co-hosts the Dresbert podcast. Is that right? Previously, she ran the National Security Network and held senior positions in the White House and State Department under President Bill Clinton, as well as worked in Capitol Hill and for the International Crisis Group. We also welcome Sylvia Mishra, who is the New Tech Nuclear Officer at the European Leadership Network and a doctoral researcher at the Department of Defense at King's College London. Her research focuses on nuclear strategy and nonproliferation, Southern Asian security, grand strategy, and emerging technologies. Sylvia held a number of very prestigious fellowships and published numerous book chapters, journal articles, and opinion pieces. Importantly, she also co-chairs the CBRN working group for Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, the so-called WECAPs, right? And the Indian Women in International Relations and Global Policy Insights. And she's also an N-Square Innovators Network Fellow and a mid-career cadre scholar at CSIS. Welcome, Sylvia. We also are very delighted to welcome Nomsan Dongwe. She is a research associate at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies and an assistant director for global recruiting at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. She is a co-founder of the WECAP's West Coast chapter and also an N-Square Innovator Network Fellow for 2020-2021. She has a master's degree in nonproliferation, terrorism studies, and financial crime management from Middlebury Institute. And previously, she served in a number of positions as a diplomat at the Zimbabwe Permanent Mission in Geneva, focusing mainly on the and other positions as well, but in Geneva, focusing mainly on the disarmament portfolio. Last, but certainly not the least, we welcome Jenny Town. She is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center and the director of Stimson's 38 North program, which provides policy and technical analysis on North Korea. Her expertise in Northeast Asia, regional security, US DPRK relations, and US South Korean alliance. Jenny is also an expert reviewer for Freedom House's famous Freedom Index, where she had worked previously on the Human Rights in North Korea project, and associate fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. She serves on the editorial board of Instinct, an online foreign policy journal. And importantly, she was named one of 50 women changing the world by Worth magazine and one of Fast Company's most creative people in business in 2019 for her role in co-founding and managing 38 North website. So welcome, everybody. I have asked each speaker to prepare their own set of reflections on the broad issues posted, you know, in the kind of the idea of a panel on gender diversity, on the remaining, on the lingering challenges, and on some of the success stories. They will each have about 7 to 10 minutes to share their remarks, and we will follow this with question and answer session, which we encourage you to participate in. So without further ado, I will ask Heather Herlbert to start a discussion.
Thank you so much, Mariana, and thank you for including me in this wonderful event. It's a heavy responsibility to go first with this incredibly talented group. And I thought what I would do is try to give a little bit of a, from my perspective, status report of where we are at this particular point in time. And in a funny way, I'll start by maybe saying something unexpectedly nice about this field and this event. And that is that I think in events like this and discussions like this, and the fact that we can assemble a group like this, is that the nuclear policy field is really actually quite far ahead of a number of other subfields in US national security and foreign policy thinking. Maybe don't tell anyone that. But I have to say, I do not get invited to panels that look like this to have this kind of conversation in other security policy areas. And so that is both a piece of good news and a piece of not so good news, as I think I expect we're going to come back to over and over during this conversation. The glass is half full and half empty. This field has had some really big wins in terms of senior representation, senior diverse representation in recent years. This field has had an incredibly vibrant discussion in recent years that has really cut across some of the senior, junior, academic policy, race, gender silos that we all operate in way too easily. And it's been a real honor to be a slight part of that. And I've been really shocked over the last year, frankly, when New America, my own institution, got very seized with equity transformation and started trying to do its own work in the wake of George Floyd's murder. I thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to learn so much from my domestic policy colleagues because they're going to be so far ahead of us in national security on this work. And, you know, I haven't come across anything like WCAPS in another space, for example. So there's a real way that this field and the diverse thought leadership of this field is really forging a path that we don't always give ourselves enough credit for. So I want to start out with something really positive on this topic. Now, having said that, my own opportunity to participate in this amazing intellectual ferment came 3 years ago when we at New America started a research process that would ultimately lead to our so-called Straitjacket Report, looking at the experience of women nuclear policymakers. And so I want to reflect a little bit on where we are, 2.5 years after the publication of that. And, we have seen, as I said, just an amazing proliferation of activity, conversation, consciousness raising. We've also seen a historic number of women placed in senior and not so senior national security and nuclear policy jobs by the Biden administration. They have just blown past. So on the one hand, they have blown past all the records that any previous administration had ever set. And that's a wonderful, fabulous thing. On the other hand, when we dig a little more closely into the numbers, and these numbers all come from the Leadership Council for Women in National Security, and I'll post, or maybe Jacob and I together will post some links to these numbers. But while the cabinet is 44% female, the National Security Council membership is only 36% female. And you see similar disparities. Oh, thanks, Noamsa. you see similar disparities when you actually start to dig granularly into a number of areas. And as I suggested, one area where I think we need more research and figuring is where are women having a harder time, sort of that there are some subfields where we're making much faster progress than others. We've also seen a really clear trend of women and women of color in particular being concentrated in more junior jobs across the national security space. And with the result that on the one hand, if you know a field in detail, you can point to amazing hires like Bonnie Jenkins at the State Department, being Undersecretary of State, but also numerous others. And yet, when you look at pictures of who is depicted representing the United States in the highest level security situations, those pictures are incredibly white and pretty darn male. And we all know that that's not the whole story, but in terms of how we think about and understand who we are, it's a non-trivial part of the story too. So the point that I want to take out of that is not, oh, the administration is good, the administration is bad, the administration has failed, the nuclear field has failed. But what we have not gotten to is real systemic change. Because one thing that we should have learned from the past 5 or 6 years is that progress in this field can very easily be reversed. And so when we wrote the Straitjacket Report, we tried to focus on, and lots of other people have done their own versions of this, but what are the changes that would really make it hard to reverse progress? What are the changes that would really institutionalize diversity in policymaking? And we actually identified 9, which is way too many. I was reminding myself when I looked back at the report this morning, and I was like, why the hell did I allow this to go to press with 9 categories of thing? But that frankly says something about what a complex problem diversity of representation, even just solving representation, how hard that is and how many pieces it has. And so I want to point to, I use the rest of my time to point to a few things where, frankly, we're not making the kind of progress that we could be making at this point. So one of the things that we called for was research-based strategies to help women and non-traditional entrants both come into the field and stay in the field. And we're not seeing the level of funding and support for research around what actually keeps diverse entrants in the field, nor are we seeing, frankly, the implementation of the things that we do already know from our field and from other fields. And I think, you can look at the what just happened to paid leave nationally and sort of say, okay, this is not the fault of the nuclear field. This is a broader national problem that we have. But it's noteworthy to me that while the COVID pandemic did force some of the flexibility that people had called for many years in the national security workforce, that flexibility is very spotty. And there are entire fractions of the national security workforce that have been unaffected by it. And at the same time, what we've seen, and it's maybe not a thing people expected to talk about in a nuclear forum, but the controversy over Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg's paternity leave, I think really tells you a lot about where the national conversation still is on the set of flexible policies that we know help women and, frankly, everybody, because everybody ends up with care responsibilities of some kind at some point in their lives. And there is this idea that the more elevated the job, the more divorced one should be from the rest of one's life. And we haven't, not only have we not made any progress on that, I actually think we've kind of gone backwards as our electronic workspace has made it, I can sit in this office and work 24/7. So that's an area where both the research and, frankly, the expectations are going, to my mind, entirely the wrong way. Similarly, I'm not sure that we're making any progress on the actual straitjacket. which is this idea that there's a set of core norms, beliefs, ideology, theology, if you will, that one has to take on to work in the nuclear field. And I, as an outsider, I look forward to others' comments on this. But as a close Washington outsider, I see very little evidence that we are chipping away at the straitjacket. And if anything, I think I've seen some developments in recent weeks that might tend to be reinforcing that homogeneity, and particularly enforcing it on women in the field. So that is my kind of concluding longer term concern about where we are, that we have, we've really broken the code. And again, if you had told me at the beginning of my career 30 years ago that we would have these kinds of conversations, I would have rolled my eyes at you. And I would have been like, oh, those hippies, that's never going to happen. So we really have changed this field enormously, but we have not changed the way upper level policy is being made. And we've made it so a woman, provided she fits into a particular mold, can fit into the structure, but we've hardly really begun the work of changing the structure, is I think maybe where I'll finish my introductory comments.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful to lay for us sort of the lay of the land and the state of the field, so we can build our discussion upon that. I will ask Sylvia, perhaps you would like to go next and offer your perspective.
Sure. Thank you so much, Mariana. I'm so delighted to participate in this panel, and especially so because I know we have a webinar of panelists who are and who have worked to advance and combat issues of gender inequality. And I've been so fortunate to work with several of them on this panel in varying capacities. So appreciate that. My comments are structured discussing one truth, one fallacy, and one opportunity. And it really teases a lot from what Heather spoke about. And we, of course, all benefited so much from the consensual Straitjacket Report. But I also kind of want to give a little bit of framing about the nuclear policy field specifically, and the landscape in general about gender inequality in this field. Nuclear policy issues, as we know, are complex. Its challenges, its effects and ramifications, and various mitigation strategies invite deeper thinking and demands a variety of perspectives, especially on gender equality. As the nuclear policy field is changing, it is at a reflection point today, and several factors like renewed focus on geopolitical rivalries, the rapid pace of technological developments, and the integration of new and emerging technologies with strategic weapons, the ever-widening political divide between nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots, waning arms control efforts and treaties, the threat of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and weakening of norms and taboos are separately, individually, and are collectively contributing to the distinct shifts that we are seeing in nuclear policy landscape. And amidst this, a critical but mostly an overlooked and understudied component of nuclear policy is some of the systemic racism challenges and racial inequity, injustices and inequities that exist in the nuclear policy field. And therefore, it is important for us to be intentional about gender inclusivity and promote gender diversity and equality. But when I talk about being diverse, it's also important to underscore there's need to be diverse when it comes to also gender of thoughts, of socioeconomic backgrounds, of experiences and age in the field. And therefore, it's vital for us to delve a little bit deeper on what are the questions of diversity, equity, inclusivity in the field that we should be grappling with when it comes to representation and culture. And as we strive to pick up the pieces and build up better, I want to share one truth, one fallacy, and one opportunity at this moment to combat gender inequality and elevate and build the agencies of the unrepresented and underrepresented voices. A truth, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda that was adopted by the United Nations Security Council 1325, almost 20 years ago, played a central role in raising awareness about the positive impact of women participating in peace and security discourses, and really elevated discussions on the increased inclusion of women. In the past 2 decades, we indeed have come a long way. And I think Heather really very eloquently summed up that we have made a lot of great strides and advances. But it is also important to not just diversify who is speaking, but it is important and critical for us to underscore that who is heard. And therefore, to make these shifts in the mindset and accommodate who is heard, often statistically, we have seen the numbers still remain disappointing. In the United States, overall, in nonprofit boards, we have statistically seen that 5% and less than 5% of board seats are held by women of color in both non-profits and for-profit organizations. A Rethink Media study recently has revealed that a representative sample of all US media coverage on nuclear weapons issues so far, it's just 86% of the sources quoted were men and 14% were women. And to dovetail and dig a little bit more deeper, only 7% were from women of color, 15% from men of color. Discussing about fallacy, we're often asked who work in this field is, where is the data on how women's participation in peace and security significantly changes processes and outcomes? For one thing, and this is something that Sarah Bidgood and I have written in our published work and underscored and highlighted the McKinsey studies, which shows that companies with greater and better balance of gender diversity has improved group thinking and obviously generates better outcomes. Just to also underscore and flag some of the recent developments, women have played a crucial role in the negotiation of the nuclear ban treaty, as well as the nuclear agreements with Iran. In addition, the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs has been headed by women twice, Izumi Nakamitsu since 2017, and Angela Kane from 2012 to 2015. And a lot, and they have spawned a number of initiatives which are led by women and which really focuses on bolstering the equities of women and women of color working in this field and raising and elevating their voices. So this also says that combating gender inequality when it comes to addressing the threat of WMD, if we are not making those strides, the gender gap really makes us less effective, less competitive to battle and navigate the challenges of the 21st century. And then the third point about an opportunity, I think like a lot has been discussed about WGAPs, but one thing I would like to highlight is the fact that we have spawned different initiatives, especially focused on mentorship and also reverse mentorship, which matches mentors with mentees. We have almost 200 mentees now working with several of their mentors. And this is important to flag because the dissemination of education, the value of non-proliferation and disarmament education in this field really helps build agency for a number of young girls and scholars. I myself have been a part of several mentorship initiatives like Girl Security at WCAPS and various other organizations. Just to conclude, I would say it's important for us to reflect on some important issues that Undersecretary Bonnie Jenkins have said, but I think she's very eloquently and also powerfully just recently in one of her statements said, to those decision makers, and I quote her, who are threatened by the notions of change, let me say that change is inevitable. You can be a part of it, or you will find yourself on the wrong side of history. It's your choice. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. And thank you for finishing with those powerful words from Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. Building on that, Jennytown, would you like to go next with your remarks?
Great. Thank you, Mariana. And I really, one, appreciate this panel and this discussion in general. And I agree a lot with the points that Heather and that have already been brought up earlier in this conversation. You know, my experience is in the nuclear field, but in sort of a subset also of the nuclear field. And I think the more niche you get, the less progress you've seen over time. And so when I do participate in broader nuclear policy, kind of core nuclear policy events, I am always amazed at, you know, a pretty good gender balance in the participation of those events, because working on Korea and working on Asia issues, you don't see that. And a lot of that is driven, of course, there's cultural context to that. And that cultural context also takes away some of the pressure and acknowledgement of the problem that exists in, for instance, in the broader nuclear field. And so, you know, I recall a time where there was a senior policy discussion that was going on between a Korean think tank and a US think tank. There was about 60 people in the room, and I counted 4 women. And one Black person, everyone else was either on the Korean side, it was all Korean, of course, and on the US side, it was mainly predominantly white, with one African American in the room. And also, you know, I think the African American man and I were basically the only people under 50 as well that were included in the discussion. And so, you know, I think when you have those demographics, you have a very different conversation. And, you know, especially in the Korea policy field, in DC, a lot of the people who are working on this come from also a very specific background as well. A lot of them have that government profile in their background and bring, you know, some of those entrenched views and biases to the discussion as well. So until you have a more diverse field, it's hard to start to think differently about the situation and about different ways to tackle some of these persistent problems. And this is something, you know, very prevalent when working on North Korea and on the North Korean nuclear issue. I would say, you know, this is starting to change, especially sort of in mid-career level and in the younger generation. Surprisingly, in DC right now, the Korea policy chairs at the major think tanks are mostly chaired by women and Korean women at the moment, Korean American women at the moment, which is very different than what it was, you know, when I started working in DC on Korea policy back in, you know, 10, 15 years ago now. So that is a welcome change. It's an incremental, very slow change, but it is changing. And last night, actually, I just chaired a next generation scholar dialogue, which was a wonderful discussion. It was, you know, very robust participation, a lot of really interesting perspectives and ideas. And I was also very pleased to see that of that participant group that we put together, I would say it was at least 70% female participation, and the women were very vocal and very engaged in the process. Because the other thing that tends to happen is when there's so few women, they tend to be more reluctant to speak up, because it can be very intimidating. I know I've been in several meetings and several forums and several panels where I am the only woman that is speaking in the speaker realm, who isn't serving coffee, isn't taking notes, right? And so, you really do have to have pretty high confidence in those situations to be part of the discussion. And, I've really had to get used to get real comfortable being uncomfortable. And this is something that I've really, tried to pass on to a lot of the young women that I work with, is, to really start to step out of their comfort zones and really get comfortable being uncomfortable, knowing that in order to create change, it's not going to be easy. There is going to be resistance. And we do have to be a bit more forward than, we're maybe usually in real life. I would say also, and especially being a woman of color in this field and being probably, one of the younger people who's created a space for myself in this field. Being a woman in this field, you also have to deal with, there isn't a real sense of equity in knowledge. You always be questioned more for your views. And you'll also have to deal with the, appearance politics of it all, of like, did they like your makeup? Was your hair okay? I was once on an interview on Al Jazeera, and someone made the effort to email me and tell me that he didn't like the way my mouth formed words. It wasn't about what I said. There was no discussion of what I had actually said and, whether or not he disagreed with the views. He just didn't like the way my mouth formed words. And these are not the kind of, this isn't the kind of feedback that men get or have to deal with. And so, there's always that. And I think, in terms of being the only woman in the room, you have to be over prepared. You have to, be ready to be questioned on everything. You'll always get the sort of, you should always expect at some point someone is going to disagree with you, and instead of talking, about why they disagree with you, is going to come back instead and talk about their credentials. Well, when I did this, and when I was in this position, as if that makes their view better. And sometimes it does, and oftentimes it doesn't. But there's always sort of that gender politics that does go on. And I think, there's been mention of mentorship in this process. Mentors are incredibly important. And I've been fortunate to have really good mentors in my life that have helped open doors for me. Of course, then, but then I have to be ready to walk through those doors as well. It can't just be, relying on someone to make the case for you. But I remember talking to one of my mentors about, how, especially in the Korea field, there was such a lack of senior level women and role models, and sort of the systemic institutional reasons for that, because his initial response to it was, one, he'd never really thought about it. And two, he was like, well, I guess women just aren't interested in this topic. And so we had a long conversation about this, of, like, one, women, especially of a certain era, were never encouraged to go into that. We're never hired for those positions that would give them the credentials to move up in that field. It isn't a matter of interest, it's a matter of access and opportunity. And if you don't have the access and opportunity, if you aren't exposed to these things, if you aren't encouraged to do them, if you're actively discouraged from doing them, no, you're not going to have the same representation in those fields. And so I think, one of the most important things, like, yes, there's, especially since George Floyd, there's been a greater recognition that diversity matters, and that there needs to be accountability for it. But there also needs to be greater efforts to create the pipelines to have an actual diverse talent pool to choose from. And I think, this is a huge problem that we deal with, is that, there isn't necessarily the access and exposure to these issues and the encouragement of young girls and women to move into these fields and explore these fields. And even once they get to that point, a lot of the think tank world, for instance, a lot of the policy world, there's also small institutions, limited jobs, and then it becomes a hiring factor as well. So you might get people interested, but there might not be jobs, and then they cycle out as well. But, so I think more needs to be done, to encourage, if you really want to get into to have greater socioeconomic diversity, greater racial diversity in this field, there has to be more efforts put into building the pipelines for that, and really, starting high school levels and not just at colleges, and not just at elite colleges. And I think that's another big problem in the DC community, is that, access, it plays a big role in how people find jobs, how people become aware that certain jobs even exist. I grew up in northern Minnesota in a very rural area. And when I grew up, I had no clue what this world was like, what kinds of jobs were out there, what people in DC really did for a living. And, the kinds of things that I'm doing now, I never even imagined were possible back then. And so, I think a lot more needs to be done to reach out to a broader base of young people to talk about what's actually possible. What does it mean to work on nuclear weapons? What is the range of opportunities? What is the range of experience that different people bring to it? And how to really prepare people and encourage people to think about this as a real option. And I think I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenny, for the sort of genuine and very personal account. And it made me think of the gender tax that Heather's report has discussed, sort of the extra effort and the extra levels of anxiety and the extra work that we all have to do to navigate these spaces. And now, Nomsam Dongwe, please, the floor is yours. And can I just say that, as rare as it is to see an African-American woman in this field, to see an African woman in this field is rarer still. So we really look forward to your unique perspective.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. I've been having so much fun listening to the other panelists, and it's always an additional pleasure when you sort of have been consuming their content asynchronously, like without any connection, but due to the fact that you're in this field, and then you finally get to sort of like put the face, the name, and the work. So that's been amazing. I wanted to start off by just saying I came to discernment in a very circuitous manner. It wasn't planned. I started with the legal profession and career before going into foreign service, and then obviously spending 3.5 years at the UN office in Geneva, mainly focusing on disarmament issues. And I can definitely testify to being in rooms where women were a fraction of the people present. And I ended up in Monterey, specializing in this field. And I must say, my superhero origin story obviously has a direct link to Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, because she started WCAPS just as I was debating whether it was worth staying in the field. So in answer to the question about representation definitely does matter, whether it's representation about gender or ethnicity or any of those intersections. So I'd like to start off with like a big picture and then sort of like narrow in. The World Economic Forum published their Future of Jobs report last October. And one of the things that they found was that the skills gap continues to be high, because obviously we're in the fourth industrial revolution. We're going into automation and that kind of thing. And they said on average, around 40% of workers will require reskilling of 6 months or less. And 94% of business leaders expect employees to pick up new skills on the job, which is a sharp intake from 65% in 2018. So in 2 years, it's almost doubled this expectation. The other thing they found was that in the absence of proactive, and the key word here is proactive efforts, inequality is likely to be exacerbated by the dual impact of technology and the pandemic recession. Jobs held by lower wage workers, women, and younger workers were more deeply impacted in the first phase of the economic contraction that was caused by COVID-19. So and this is the part that really scared me, in comparison to the impact of the global financial crisis of 2008 on individuals with lower education levels, the COVID-19 crisis impact is far more significant and likely to deepen existing inequalities. So when we're talking about gender representation, it's interesting how all of these things just intersect, whether it's in nuclear or in any other field. This field already has an imbalance of representation. And then when you add, I really don't know how I feel about this, but they're calling it a she-demic, a she-session, where you have women who have fallen out of like the workplace in every field, simply because of the demands of family and personal lives, something that Heather touched upon as well. This resonated with me because I myself am a woman in the field with a young child, and I know the challenges that I've been facing. And I think one of the most important things that we can take away from conversations like this is that just as much as, you know, Jenny is an expert on the Korean Peninsula and issues like that, I'm always curious to see how many events and sessions we're invited to where we're also talking about the actual brass tacks of what we do, because that as well is part of the bigger consensual straitjacket that Heather and her co-authors were speaking of. So where are we? I'm going to say, in terms of gender equity in this field, we are very far from where we should be. That's my knee-jerk response. And I also have data to prove it. Unidir issued a report called Still Behind the Curve, where they looked at representation of gender in disarmament diplomacy. And let's just say 32% was the highest point in which diplomats in multilateral meetings dealing with WMDs were women, and 68% were men. On a leadership level, men outnumbered women 3-1. And the previous chair of Unidir, Rana Sadwan, observed that it would, quote, take another 2 decades to reach gender parity, end quote. So that's until 2065. We're looking at potentially having a 50-50 representation in this field on a multilateral stage in 2065. And this was before the pandemic. So where we are. So what are the experiences for a woman like myself and a woman of color? Well, I think implicit bias, and it is doubled by those intersections, and maybe tripled when you say I am a woman, Black, and from Africa. So I had 2 stories that I wanted to share. One was a Black diplomat that I knew in Geneva, who was from a nuclear weapon possessing state, that was handed a coat by an ambassador from a European country because they just assumed he was working there and he wasn't there for the meeting. And that was a he. As for me, I'm from a non-nuclear weapon state. So many of my experiences involve the double take of, oh, a woman, and then, oh, are you lost? Which country did you say you're from again? Are you sure you're in the right room? Yes, I am. You know, so I don't know. That's the state of affairs, or it was anyway when we were still in person. And I think it's something that Jenny has touched upon, Sylvia touched upon, and Heather touched upon, is that you have these lingering obstacles because implicit bias impacts all the decision-making, whether it's hiring, whether it's who gets to talk about what, or who's invited to a panel, or whose work is promoted and lauded and touted, then, you're just going to have that sort of result. And like we already talked about, the gender roles that are assigned outside of work as well contribute to making things difficult, because if you are going to try and have a family or any of those things, it's just assumed. I think reports have shown that employers just assume, oh, if you're a certain age, that at some point you're going to choose to have a family, and then that will disrupt their profits or their margins. Now, on the question of, we've talked about the negative, we've talked about the big picture. On the question of progress, I think we have a lot of success stories. The Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security that was adopted in 2000 was an incredible start to going to progress. I think WCAPS is a success story. I think N Square is a success story. Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy is an incredibly successful story because they've also managed to get the people who've signed on to it to make sure that they don't host things like manels, which is all male panels. So the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons is a success story. Most of the advocacy for that treaty was led by female diplomats and female members of civil society. And it showed what can be done in a field that is considered predominantly male. Not to say that men were not involved, but there was a large female presence that, really helped to make that difference. And I think all the work that is being done by organizations like yourselves, UNIDIR that I spoke of earlier, and of course WCAPS, is just an example of the success that is happening in the field. It's just that it's incremental. So sometimes it's not as, like, wow, pizzazz as, I don't know, we would like. And I think on the last point about what sort of transformative effects can diversity bring into the field, I will reference an article that I read by Harvard Business Review. And in it, they talked about, I'll drop a link to the article. In it, they talked about how there were 3 things that they believed would change the conversation. So they said, enough already with the business case. Everyone says, businesses have shown that it's more successful when they're more diverse. And they said, first of all, platitudes must give way to sound, empirically based conclusions, which meant don't just sprinkle in some diversity and then say we fixed the problem. They're saying actually, carry out things that are going to make those diverse hires effective. Second, business leaders must reject the notion that maximizing shareholder returns is paramount. Instead, they must embrace a broader vision of success that encompasses learning, innovation, creativity, flexibility, equity, and human dignity. And finally, leaders must acknowledge that increasing demographic diversity does not by itself increase effectiveness. What matters is how an organization harnesses diversity and whether it's willing to reshape its power structure. So my last word would be, when it comes to the nuclear field, we know that the communities that have been affected the most have been predominantly non-white. Whether it is the uranium mining and extraction in the Southwest in Arizona, or whether it is uranium extraction in the DRC, or nuclear testing in Algeria, or in the Pacific Islands, or what Kazakhstan, or whether we're talking about their use, which was the one time they were used in Japan. So I think there are 2 tracks to tackling this issue. Institutional changes in existing organizations is the first. And then the second would be continue to create the spaces for ourselves and demand to be heard by putting out good work or content and lift as we climb. Thank you.
Wonderful. Lift as we climb. Love it. Last but certainly not the least, Sarah Bidgood, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mariana. And I am so grateful to the Belfer Center for convening this incredibly important panel. It's great to see friends and those whom I admire and have not yet had a chance to meet. So thank you for putting this together. It falls to me to be the last in a tremendous group of speakers today. And so I apologize if I repeat some of what has been heard, but I think that that just emphasizes the kind of shared perspectives among a group of diverse women who are working in this space. And so I think there's some utility to reiterating some of what we've already discussed and summing up a little bit of our conversation before we move into a discussion. So I'm going to start by describing the nuclear field as I see it now in terms of gender equity, and I'm going to echo here what a number of my other co-panelists have said. It's no secret, and it never has been a secret, that there are many fewer women who work in this space than men. And I think all of us on an anecdotal basis have been able to observe what this looks like. Sometimes it means serving on a panel where you're the only woman. Sometimes it means going into a room and noticing that you are one of just a few women who is in a conversation about nuclear issues. But what I think has been really welcome over the last several years has been a broader effort in our space to quantify what that means, what that actually looks like, how many women really are working in this space. And that's in many ways the first step toward addressing this imbalance. So just to, again, pick up on the statistics that others have mentioned, right now, about 33% of the people who work at the NNSA are women. About 30% of nuclear experts on staff at leading think tanks and NGOs who deal with nuclear issues are women. Nomza mentioned the TPNW negotiations, and I completely agree that that is an example of women's leadership in this space. But for the record, only 31% of the delegates who were registered for those negotiations were women. So even there, we still see that there is this imbalance in numbers. And of course, thinking ahead to the 10th NPT review conference, whenever that may happen, the last time we convened one of those conferences, only 26.5% of the delegates were women. So as these numbers suggest, and as Heather indicated in her comments at the outset of our panel, somewhere between 20 and 30% of nuclear experts and practitioners are women. And that's pretty consistent irrespective of the sector. So I was highlighting a number of different spaces, and those numbers are pretty consistent, which I think is significant. The good news is that landscape looks a lot more balanced than it did in, say, 1980. And that's the other part of the research that Nomza was highlighting from UNIDIR. They do track how these levels have changed over time. And we do see that there has been a significant evolution in the direction of parity, although there's clearly a long way to go. The bad news, though, is that these numbers are still really low when we consider that about 45% of the global workforce are women. So we still have quite a ways to even get to what other spaces look like. Obviously, this is problematic, but I think it's important to articulate explicitly why, because that's an important first step toward addressing these issues. And I think it's useful in this regard to reflect on how the discourse has changed, even in the short time that I've been focused on this issue in my own work. So when I first started looking at these issues in, probably 7 years ago or so in the context of my own work in this field, what I heard most frequently is that this was a fairness issue, that the lack of gender balance was an issue of fairness. So the logic here is that nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction more broadly don't discriminate on the basis of gender. All of us would be affected by their use. And in fact, there is research that suggests that women would be disproportionately affected by the use of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. And so therefore, the bottom line is that nobody would be excluded from experiencing the impact of these weapons, and therefore no group should be excluded from the conversations around the policies that govern their use. But another reason, and one that I've been happy to hear cited increasingly frequently in conversations about gender equity starting in about 2017, relates to the quality of our work. And I think, as every single one of the panelists have referenced so far, research from the private sector does provide quantitative evidence for what I think many of us know to be true intuitively. And that is that diverse groups, particularly gender diverse groups, generate better outcomes than homogeneous groups. In private companies, as Sylvia Mishra mentioned, this translates into higher revenues. So companies with more gender diverse boards make more money. There's not a direct parallel there to the kinds of work that we do, but one additional factor that I think is useful comes from the STEM world. We know that diverse author groups produce research that is more highly cited and has a higher impact factor than homogeneous groups of authors. And to me, that suggests something about the quality of the ideas that are being generated by those diverse groups of authors. So when it comes to preventing the spread and the use of weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons in particular, as we're discussing here, we can't afford anything but the best possible outcomes. And we're limiting our own ability to do our jobs well by excluding women and other marginalized groups from the conversation. We need that diversity and gender diversity in particular in the context of this panel if we're going to be effective. And while that is true in any space, it really matters in our environment. So why, knowing all of this, why is there still gender imbalance in the field? I'm not going to tee myself up to act like I can answer that question, because obviously I can't. There's a huge constellation of reasons, but I'm going to outline a couple that I see. First, as my co-panelists have mentioned, we have systemic challenges that do make it more difficult for women to enter the nuclear policy space and to stay there in the long run. I think we can intuit a lot of what these probably are. Maybe lots of travel. I know in my personal experience, that's certainly been the case. Relatively few job opportunities at the top levels of organizations. They tend to be kind of hierarchical. Lower pay relative to other parts of the private sector potentially could be one. And obviously these are not unique challenges to our field. But with all that said, I really was struck by Heather's comment at the outset of our panel, which is that we need more data to understand where the leaks in the career pipeline are so that we can figure out how to take effective action and to plug those. So I'm kind of speculating about what I think these leaks are and the reasons why people leave, but I would really like to see some research and concrete data that help me understand if my assumptions are correct or if I need to adjust them and therefore what we're supposed to do about them. Second, picking up on what I think Jenny said really powerfully, there are still a lot of deeply internalized biases about who should be working on hard security issues and who can talk in such a way that allows them to be in this space. And nuclear policy really falls into this category of issues. These, of course, aren't new. Carol Cohn has been writing about this since 1987. But what's happened in the intervening 3 years is that they've been allowed to calcify these biases, and these kind of self-limitations on who is part of the conversation have become more entrenched. And I think that means we need to do some really deep work as a field and as a society to change our own assumptions around who belongs at the nuclear decision-making table. And here I think it's really important to point something out that I don't always hear in these conversations, which is that, no one is immune to the prevailing stereotypes, least of all women. And that's part of what's so insidious about them. So as part of this effort, I think we really need to figure out how to encourage people of all genders to consider careers in our field so that nobody is self-censoring or opting out or taking themselves out of the running for things before they've had the chance to figure out if this is work that actually speaks to them or a place where they feel like they could find, a meaningful life for themselves. So for my part, as Mariana mentioned in my bio, I've taken up this challenge by focusing on getting undergraduate women interested in this field. And I completely agree with Jenny that it needs to start even earlier in the career pipeline, but my work has been focused on undergraduates. And I'm focused here because I think, reflecting on my own experience, the way that we think about our imagined futures, the people who we want to become in that kind of liminal space that is college, can have a really powerful influence on shaping where we set our professional sights after we graduate. And oftentimes by the time students get to graduate school, they've already reached those conclusions or had to make some choices about what that's going to look like for them. Although, as I can attest in my own path, that's not always the case. So perhaps I'm an exception to the rule. But I've also found in my own research that very few students have the opportunity to learn about nuclear issues or WMD issues in depth at the undergraduate level, at least here in the United States. And even disproportionately fewer of the students who choose to take that limited number of classes are women. So we already see some of these imbalances that we're talking about in the professional space beginning at this very initial start of the pipeline here. So that's the rationale behind the Young Women in Non-Proliferation Initiative that I lead at CNS. Part of what I do is give talks to undergraduate women at different colleges and universities, schools in the Midwest. Jenny, you'll be happy to hear some of our land grant schools, and just try to help them understand what the career landscape looks like. And really part of what I try to do is help them draw connections to their own interest areas. So not just thinking that if you are not a political science major or an IR major, you don't have a place in this conversation. We need anthropologists. We need aspiring journalists to help us tell the stories that we're forming in our research. It's geography students, cultural geography students, it's linguists, the list goes on and on and on. And then I take those interested students and I pair them with expert mentors who can help them begin to develop that expertise and help them figure out how to apply their own skills and interests to the professional space, while also building a peer and a professional network if that's the direction they want to go. And I know Susan Burke is on the line, and she is one of our mentors in the program, and I'm so grateful to her for sharing her time and expertise, and those of all of our other mentors. So I just want to wind up here on a positive note. We've been talking about some of the success stories that we see in the field, and I just want to say that I have found working with that population of students to be incredibly rewarding. And it is so obvious to me in my interactions with them that there's a thirst for information about the field. The interest is there. It's not the case that, women are not interested in this space. Young women are interested in this space. They want to know more. They want to know how they can apply their skills and interests here toward making the world a safer place and work that's going to allow them to lead a meaningful life when they finish their undergraduate work. Obviously, not every single one of the students that I meet through these interactions is going to go on to pursue a career in this field. And I think that's fine. I think I've been successful if they understand that they could do that if they wanted to, and to know how to do that down the line if their path takes them in that direction. So I think it's really essential to start dismantling some of those internalized biases that I mentioned previously, and that one of the ways we can do that is by exposing younger students to the options that are available to them and making sure that they understand there's a network to help them do that work. So I'm going to stop here for now. Thank you again so much to my co-panelists. Thank you, Mariana, for convening this important conversation. And I really look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much. All of these reflections have been extremely helpful and build very nicely upon each other. And I would want to encourage our audience to post questions in the Q&A box to all the panelists together or anyone in particular. And while the audience is doing that, let me just go back to you, Heather, and pick up on something you said in your consensual straitjacket reference as to how difficult it is to actually change the mold, right? We can bring more people, more women, and people of color into the mold, but the mold is still the mold. And it seems that drawing on your report, some spaces like non-proliferation and disarmament and arms control, the subfields of the larger nuclear fold, are more amenable to more innovative thinking and more diversity, whereas there's some kind of really hard security subfields like deterrence and posture and really sort of military and technology focused subfields that are less immutable to these changes, and sort of this priesthood that gets that, and the guardians are a force to be reckoned with, as it were, and it's a lot harder for women to navigate those spaces. And something that came up throughout our discussion, and talking about the success stories, such as, for instance, TPNW as being taken as a success story for kind of the feminine perspectives or the female participation. I wonder how we avoid these sort of stereotypings of sort of the feminine doves versus the masculine hawks, and further somehow entrench this polarization, right? You work on polarization in other fields, and perhaps, do you think it's happening somewhat in our field where the hard kind of deterrence posture thing becomes more immutable, more defensive, as it were, from these more inclusive subfields?
Oh gosh, thank you. That is a huge question. So maybe three thoughts I have, and I'm guessing others have thoughts on this as well. One, if you look at the history of this field in the last 50 years, where you really see women and people of color establishing themselves is when new things are established that are somewhat maybe a little bit to the side, maybe a little bit tenuous. So I don't think it's an accident that women first start making inroads when the Arms Control Disarmament Agency is established, right? That women, the women don't immediately get footholds in sort of the inner sanctum of the priesthood, if you'll let me belabor that metaphor a little more. And we heard similarly from folks on the nonproliferation side that actually they found, and Noam, I'd be really curious about your experience both in academics and outside, that they found actually bio and chem a little easier than nuclear. And they found sort of things that had come along and become fields more recently, part of which I think in my own experience, and I mean, by getting a job in conventional arms control and confidence building measures at a ridiculously young age, the fields that everyone's not sure, oh, are these things really going to go anywhere? That's not prestigious. You know, my professor, my advisor hasn't heard of that field, hasn't worked in it. So I do think a way that folks from disadvantaged groups of all kinds have made our way in is by being willing to go where kind of the darlings of the structure as it is aren't willing to go. And that, you know, is wonderful because it means you get to do the most cutting edge new stuff, but it does tend to leave some of the traditional spaces a little more untouched. So that's, Mariana, one thought I have in response to your question. Another, and this addresses the point that Matt Bunn just made in the chat about, you know, we don't want to forget there are some women who really did just put their heads down and say, okay, the hardest nut to crack is the nut I want to crack. That sometimes the experience of seeing that actually makes it harder, not easier for women who follow. And I think Jenny and Sylvia both spoke to this in different ways, that younger folks ask themselves, well, what do I have to do in order to succeed in this field? And I have my own memory of a woman who worked at ACTA in the 80s and 90s when I knew her. And she, I mean, was a real pathbreaker, but she used to say things to me and she meant it kindly, like, you should quit your job and go home and get married because otherwise it'll be too late and you'll be like me and you'll never get married. And I was like, what are you talking about? And I found that as a 20-something in the 90s really offensive, but I think she also meant it from a not bad place, but that's the kind of thing that really potentially scares people off. I wanted to make one other comment, which grows from that, which is how depressing it is for me to hear Jenny in particular say things that I could have said, you know, when I got out of school 30 years ago. And so a thing that I really want to underline in all of these conversations is that I think the generations represented by each of us, plus one or two generations before me, each time those women thought, we're going to be the last ones that have to put up with this crap. And, you know, I have my own story about my friend in undergrad who said, oh, women don't like arms control. And so I really challenge us about sort of whether what we're doing is deep enough, when so many of the core underlying biases kind of reassert themselves. And to at least try to circle back, Mariana, to the question you actually asked, we're in this moment where I think a polarization that we're seeing really broadly in our society is unfortunately making a particularly American version of masculinity synonymous with a particular kind of security. So women are now faced with an even more stark choice. And to be fair, so to have a little bit of empathy for our colleagues, policymakers, both male and female, who are trying to bridge that divide, now have the problem that if they seem to show too much sympathy to questions of diversity, they're coming down on the girl side. And that is just a huge, huge problem for our issue in particular, which is kind of where the rubber hits the road on, can somebody who looks like all of us make you feel secure?
That inevitably reflects on how we look rather than how the security looks. But to build on that, Jenny, I have a question for you, because you've related such a lovely sort of set of personal reflections about, growing up in, this sort of remote place and not knowing at all that these sort of opportunities exist. And we have established, across, I think all of us, all of the speakers, that it's certainly not, the lack of interest in women in arms control and minorities and in these conversations. But I can also imagine that someone coming from, minority background, someone on whom, their whole family is riding, and all of the hopes of their family is riding, they would want to go to a space that is vibrant, where they have opportunities for growth and promotion, where there's, innovation, where there's good money to be made. Why would they go to nuclear policy if they can go to Silicon Valley and make $200,000 off the get-go? So I think, the kind of the shape of the field and the kinds of innovations and thinking and growth that we bring to it, they're also part of the way of shaping the pipeline and creating a set of incentives. And you are someone who's done quite sort of innovative projects and innovative things. What would you, based on that, what would you say to these young people who are entering the field? What kind of things and opportunities and innovations could they hope for?
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind is a lot of people tend to look to, very senior people to get advice on how to advance in a field. But the professional world has changed so much over time. And a lot of the positions that exist today didn't exist 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Technology is changing the way we do business in every field. And even for us now, we're constantly learning, reinventing, reassessing, and trying to build new projects. And so there isn't one path to this. And there isn't one way in which it looks, in which it has to look. And I think, I've heard people trying to mentor young people on the path to, working in DC on nuclear issues, that came from a very different place in a very different era, and really discouraged people from moving forward, because, they didn't have the right educational background from the very beginning. Or, I had a colleague of mine tell a sophomore in college she was already behind and she would never catch up. She was a sophomore in college. How can she be behind? And for me, I didn't start out in the nuclear field. I spent the first 10 years of my career working more on, the comms side more on comms issues and public relations, and organizational building, and then got more into the policy and substantive and technical content. So did sort of that career change in the middle of it. And I think one of the reasons why, 38 North has been so successful is because, because I did have that experience, and we could create something very different, bringing in a number of different skills that can highlight the knowledge that we had and create a platform to really deal with this in a different way. And so without that, when we try to direct people on a specific path, it can also be very discouraging. And I think there needs to be a greater understanding of the opportunities that are here, but with an acknowledgement that there's no one path to get there, and that the landscape is constantly changing as well. And so, being set on, very few people ever know what they want to do when they grow up. When they graduate college, they need to try a few things, but that doesn't set them behind. That there's always different ways to be engaged in this process, and there's always ways to enter in at different angles and at different times in your life. I think there was one question in the chat about, like, what should they do to prepare? And, if you're interested in it, keep pursuing in it. You might not work directly in the field right away. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can still be interested in it. You can still pursue it. You can still get in at different angles at different times, and bring different skills to it and different perspectives to it that will be useful in the future as well. Just because you don't have a linear path doesn't exclude you from the conversation or from the opportunities that lie ahead.
Thank you so much for that. So that echoes very much with what Sarah was actually saying, that there isn't sort of this, a very set of moves and steps, and from college to nuclear policy that one should necessarily follow. And indeed, those kind of diversity of backgrounds will be something that will contribute to the field, will contribute and make it more interesting and innovative, and bring new perspectives. Sylvia, you deal with very much kind of technical, in a way, hard security problems, new technologies that come in and how they affect relationships of deterrence. You delivered an excellent presentation at our MTA seminar just a couple of weeks ago, I believe, and you work with some of these very senior people in the field, men, but it seems that in addition to navigating kind of the very Western structures and norms and expectations, we all also bring a part of our different background communities, and there's a certain additional set of norms and expectations that might shape our path. You are from India, right? How have you navigated sort of these multiple layers of gendered expectations as you're making your way through the field?
Thank you, Mariana, for the question. First of all, I think, and just like really to substantiate on a lot of the points that were already, some excellent points that were already made, I think it's important that we are thinking about tackling these issues from a gendered lens, because as you rightly said, with emerging technologies coming in the play, governments are not the only, do not just possess these technologies, right? Like these emerging technologies are now carried forward and advanced through various private organizations. So there are multiple players and stakeholders at large in the nuclear policy, national security field. And therefore, I think it is extremely important, because as we see some of these technologies advancing, especially, for example, say artificial intelligence that is rapidly advancing and being incorporated in military doctrines or systems platform, the data that we feed in is going to significantly impact how these data is being processed. So, for example, the recently launched NATO artificial intelligence strategy paper talks and gives credence to the fact that there needs to be gender bias mitigation strategies when it comes to developing AI. So I think a lot of the points is very well taken about as and how we are developing in this field, and militaries are advancing their inventories and capabilities. It is extremely important to just diversify and take a gendered lens and approach. Talking about a little bit from my personal experience, I started, like many, my experience in the field was also a happy accident. I started working on India and US defense and security cooperation in New Delhi. And I was writing about Defense Secretary at that point of time, Secretary Carter's visit to India and transfer of technology issues amongst India and US defense cooperation. And little did I know that Secretary Perry and his team at Stanford were following some of the work of defense secretaries, and I got invited to speak at a panel in the CTBTO in Vienna. And when I received that invitation, I was told that to pass on the offer to speak on nuclear policy issues to a male colleague. And I was told that I should stick to my lane of working on geopolitics and not get involved in more technical nuclear policy issues. I think that was a significant change and a turning point in my life where I put my foot down, and I for the next couple of years I trained myself and took professional experience. And I also had amazing mentors over here in the United States. I know Ambassador Susan Burke is on the call, and also Dr. William Potter and many others. So I think it's important as in how we're talking, because the United States has a huge reservoir of soft power, and the conversations that we are having in Washington, DC and in the United States really have the power to lead and follow up conversations elsewhere in different parts of the world. And especially it is important for us, and this is something that I try to underscore and highlight every time I'm given a platform, is the importance of moving beyond a US-centric approach and also engaging the global South when it comes to different nuclear policy issues. Because at the end of the day, we do know these 9 nuclear weapons possessing states, and the multiple, it's not a bipolar competition anymore. There are different complex, multiplex deterrent relationships among these countries, and therefore moving beyond the US-centric approach, it's important to also have and engage the global South in many of these conversations. And I think the fact that there's a sense of democratization of information, and also in the last 20 months during the COVID, we've seen that technology has been an enabler of getting more diverse voices from, say, South America, from Africa, from South Asia. I think we should utilize this platform, carry forward this momentum to also get different voices from the other disparate parts of the world to engage with intention on a more gendered approach in nuclear policy field.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. I was just going to pick up this thread with Nomsa. You know, we do tend to, you know, we're based in the US, we talk to US policymakers mostly. We do tend to have very Western-centric kind of focuses, or foci, I think that's the proper way. When we talk about diversity issues and we talk about pipelines and we talk about gender, I mean, you're from a huge continent that has all these young people coming up. I mean, the demographic in Africa, you know, talk about the pipeline, right? But I imagine there's, you know, their own set of pipeline issues where how can African women get into these spaces, even within their own countries, before they move forward onto, you know, Geneva and, you know, New York and international spaces like that. And Sylvia mentioned soft power, right? the US soft power, but there's also sort of the soft power of international organizations, of networks like WCAPS and all these kinds of organizations, advocacy groups. How can we leverage those to reach beyond the US borders and exactly to engage the global South and to engage, we're talking about the African century, the century that like all of these kids are going to grow up and make a huge contribution. How can we make sure that that contribution is also made to the nuclear issue, nuclear order?
I think it all starts with intention, to be honest with you. So if the intention is there, not to riff off a Field of Dreams, if you build it, they'll come, but it's literally what is needed in order to make those overtures and to make those connections. So as you mentioned before, I know WCAPS has a Africa working group, and it is led by African women who are interested in peace and security and conflict transformation. And they are a chapter. We have a Ghana chapter as well for WCAPS. We have a Latin America chapter for WCAPS. We have a Southwest Asia and North Africa chapter. So those chapters are making the inroads into finding the people who have an interest in the topic. And then they get connected to the broader network of WCAPS, of Orgs in Solidarity, and all the people like yourselves who are working with the organization. And then I would say the IAEA has done a lot in this space as well. They have a lot of technical skills, courses, et cetera, that they host with nuclear physicists and biologists and people who are literally more on the ST part of the STEM field. So there are already efforts being made. Obviously, more could always be done, but I do agree that the United States is probably, when I did some research, the United States statistically is leagues ahead of any other country on planet Earth with regard to the nuclear non-proliferation arms control space. So if you're trying to work in this field, you're probably going to somehow, find your way on a panel in the US or with US interlocutors. So I think in that regard, and unfortunately, just due to the way the NPT is structured as well, when it comes to who has more, I don't want to say sway, but who has a bigger presence when it comes to these issues, it would definitely be the five. So I think that's basically how you do it, intention.
All right, thank you. I think it's a lot of food for thought for all of us organizations working in this field, how we want to reach beyond the US borders. Sarah, I have my last question as a prerogative of the moderator. I was just wondering, you have this wonderful experience interacting with undergraduate students and talking to them and pairing. We had a short chat before this panel, pairing them with mentors. What do you find is the biggest motivator? What sparks? What kind of set of incentives you can find in this new generation to engage in the field? Are they idealists still? Do they want to save the world? Is it kind of the prestige of kind of an elite, perceivedly elite, kind of feel like what sort of things would motivate a young person and a young woman to go in the nuclear field these days?
Oh, thank you for that question, Mariana. It's a great one, and it's hard to answer because it's not a monolithic group of students, and so they have different priorities, different interests. Depends a little bit, I think, on the exposure that they've had to the topic before I meet them. So for some students who have already been taking, poli-sci classes or IR classes, or at some schools that's the Gov department's purview, so taking those kinds of classes, they have a pretty clear understanding of what it is that they want to do. They have the vocabulary to talk about the kinds of careers they might be interested in pursuing, although they might not be familiar with the whole landscape. And so it's motivating for them to learn more about the different types of sectors a person could work in and what that diversity of careers looks like. But in some ways, it's more interesting to reflect on the students who just come to a talk that I give because their professor suggested it or because they saw it on a bulletin board in the hall and wanted to show up and thought it looked interesting. And for those students, they're really interested in open source analysis, so satellite imagery analysis, Jenny's department, that's definitely something, there's a magic there that is so exciting that I think grabs students from a lot of different disciplines. It's also helpful because not a lot of students have previous experience working with that type of data. And so when we give our talks, they're all kind of on the same playing field. And I think there's a lack of inhibition in the conversations because there's no expectation that anybody would know anything about how to do, commercial satellite imagery analysis or ground imagery analysis at the get-go. So there's kind of a safe space there to ask some questions that I think is really helpful. But in terms of thinking about, what drives people to go into the field, I think it's not predominantly wanting to diminish the nuclear danger in the way that I think it probably may have been in previous generations. I found that students find it really compelling if I'm able to draw connections to other issues that they're concerned about. So climate change, for example, thinking about the intersectionality of, the nuclear question and climate change, that's something that seems to be quite motivating. Talking about issues like this one, because everybody is so seized, and rightfully so, about civil unrest and thinking about justice in our society. And so actually talking to students about the kinds of conversations we're having in this field around diversity, equity, and inclusivity is something that is a motivating factor for them to think about a future career in this field. But I think in general, it's just fascinating to see students find their own way to develop their own authentic voice, to think about and talk about these issues. And that's something that I think mentorship can really help with. So I've been thrilled to work in this space, in an environment where there do seem to be so many initiatives aimed at doing this kind of mentorship, early pipeline type work. And I think there's no shortage of those, and there cannot be too many voices in the room when it comes to those kinds of efforts.
Thank you so much to all of you. I've learned a lot just from this discussion so far. And I know we do have some time left still, and I invite everyone in the audience to post questions to the speakers. And if any of you in the meantime have any other comments while our audience gets their thoughts together, anything to contribute that you think an important point that hasn't been made yet, I invite you to do so. Jenny?
I just wanted to add to Sarah's point that she was just talking about in terms of, how do people get interested in nuclear weapons, especially at a young age, or how do you even talk to young people about nuclear weapons? And that it often comes paired with a different issue. It isn't just about the nuclear weapons themselves. It's about, really concern for, other things that are more in their universe and that they're more familiar with. And one of the things that we've done at 38 North, for instance, is really we put together some curriculum for middle school and high school teachers to talk about North Korea's, the nuclear program in like a one classroom setting. We put together a module, and it starts with, a short video that explains what are nuclear weapons. Why is this important? Why do we care about this issue? Why has it become so contentious? And I think, these are the ways that we can start to build that capacity. And in putting together that curriculum, we worked with some middle school, high school teachers so that to make sure it was compatible with the timing that needs to be done. But then also did some actual, lectures for the teachers themselves. So we worked with the National Committee on Social Studies, National Conference on Social Studies. and did a separate session that talked a little bit about the history of Korea, talked a little bit about the North Korea program, a little train the trainers, to help them also understand that they don't have to be experts on this issue to talk about it in their classrooms. And so the threshold that we were shooting for was this idea of, the dinner time conversation. When the kids go home from school and their parents ask them, what did you do today? What did you learn today? They can talk about nuclear weapons in the context of North Korea. And, when we did this, it was back in 2017 when North Korea was on TV all the time. And, there was the fire and fury, and this was becoming a really big national security issue that felt very personal to a lot of people who didn't know how to talk about it, and especially for the students. And so I think, there's value in, it's great to hear that that CNS is doing this mentorship program and reaching out, especially to graduate students. And, it'd be great to have more initiatives that are geared towards younger audiences, just to get it in their vocabulary. It's in a broader setting, so that, again, a more diverse people, a broader group of people start to think about the issues as well as the opportunities at a very young age.
That's a very important point, Jenny. And it reminded me that I just talked to Jim Walsh at MIT the other day. He came out for drinks, and a project that he's working on is actually creating TikTok and Facebook content, video content, to inform people about some of the important kind of developments that might happen in the nuclear field in a very accessible way. But this brings me to an important point that is being raised in the chat now by Paul Guinnessy, and that pertains to funding. Right, funding for the projects that all of us are doing in the field, and the important move by the MacArthur Foundation to pull out the field. And it seems that sort of our entire field in a way is shrinking, even though the problems remain just as big, even larger. And we're trying to attract more diverse talent to the field. How do we cope with this challenge, and other alternative ways forward? I don't know if anyone would like to go first. Maybe Heather, you go ahead.
Well, I wanted to say something that addresses that, but also builds on Jenny's point, which is if we were creating national U.S. security now, would we want nuclear to be as separate a field as it is? Would we want to create a field that is so cut off from regional studies, that is so cut off from environment and energy, just to name two? And I think, this gets back to the influence of the priesthood and the self-concept that this field has. And I think this is where this may be a little controversial for some, but I think this has everything to do with why the funding situation of the field has become so difficult in recent years. That the way we conceptualize what it means to be an expert in this field and what are the important things to be an expert in and what they should be connected to is very linked to a very Cold War and a very particular view of the world and security. And I mean, if I'm really feeling ranty, I will say that actually deterrence makes no sense. I mean, as Sylvia, you pretty much flatly said, in a multipolar, great power environment. And why we persist in defining the field this way and trying to get it funded this way. I mean, not to take away the responsibility, not to say it's our fault, but I do think that clinging to those forms, it hurts the funding, it hurts innovation, it hurts the pipeline for all the reasons that you all have dominated. And in the end, it hurts policy because it doesn't accord with how the world actually works.
That's a very good point. I mean, you can't keep the field alive by just keeping it insular and kind of mummified from 30 years ago. Any other reflections on the point of funding and kind of maybe cross-germinating with other Jenny?
Yeah, I agree with Heather. And I think, that's also created a barrier to entry of new funders because it is so isolated. It is such a insular concept that, it doesn't have the broader appeal. And so, nuclear issues should be part of discussions about climate change. It should be part of discussions about social justice. It should be part of these other things. But we've built it into this elite concept. We've built this elite community of funders as well that are willing to work on this issue so that when one drops out, like MacArthur, it really creates a crisis. So not only have the funders had a real hand in shaping the community and how the community evolves in what they fund and who they fund, but also, that process has sort of boxed us out from appealing to other groups of funders in the way that people think about nuclear weapons. So I do think there is a way to get away from, this Cold War deterrence only concept of nuclear weapons and really start to expand that conversation into how nuclear weapons fit into a broader set of security issues, both traditional and non-traditional security issues.
I also quickly wanted to tease out a little bit of Heather's point about trying to reconceptualize the field. I think because there are multiple owners of technologies right now, I think it's also important for us to engage and deeply reflect about the field and how and if the private sector who are owners of several of these technologies can be or should be involved to work towards reducing nuclear dangers. I think as in how we look at or like 5 to 10 years ahead in this field, it is important to look at, because we are talking about a multi-sector kind of engagement when as in how we are trying to reduce nuclear dangers, the involvement of private sector, which are owners and which are providers of multiple technologies, and their integration with nuclear weapons should be and needs to be part of the conversations to effectively reduce the catastrophic effects of WMD. I'll stop there.
Yes, thank you so much. Any more questions from the audience or any more comments? We have a very quiet audience of this thing. I think it's Friday afternoon in many places. So we're all, but nevertheless, I think, this discussion has been extremely fruitful and extremely interesting. If there are no other questions at this point, I'm wondering if I could just each give you a minute or so to reflect and sort of give us the words of wisdom and sort of words of encouragement and some things of, pointers to watch this space for the future for, women out there who might be considering entering the field and who are working in the field. Sylvia, I don't want to put you on the spot, but here you are on the spot.
I think one of the bigger takeaways for me being in this field for almost the last 7-8 years is the importance of not just vertical networking, but also horizontal networking. And by that, I mean, it is important to work together with peers, and it's important to amplify each other's work and be sponsors of your peers' work. So that's bridging the citation gap, because I work both at the intersection of academia and policy. I think it's extremely important in both the fields to tackle the issue of citation, and especially in academia, because we see a vast amount of literature on nuclear weapons issues really comes from the Cold War era. And whilst several women have very prolifically advanced the field, I think it is important to diversify what we are looking at our syllabuses and bridge that citation gap. And then the third point is not just mentorship, but also reverse mentorship. And by that, I mean that it is important for mentees also to give feedback to their leaders who are, or mentors who are at a leadership position, who can be better informed about really the current state of play in the field.
Yes, horizontal networking, bridging the citation gap, and reverse mentorship. Those are all very, very important, good points. Sarah Bidgood, do you have parting words of wisdom?
I don't know if they're words of wisdom, but I can offer a little reflection on just what I heard and what I thought was particularly important. You know, one thing that I think Jenny mentioned in her initial remarks that we didn't really talk about is the importance of kind of putting yourself out there and how necessary that tends to be for voices who have been marginalized in our space. And I think, you know, it's worth thinking a lot about how that influences people's decision to enter the field at the outset, because that's a heavy burden to wear, and that's a lot of additional responsibility, and not everybody wants to do that, nor should they be expected to do that. And so I think maybe I hope the next step in our evolution of this conversation is thinking about how we can both navigate the need for people to put themselves out there and to advance the space in the ways that we've been talking about today, while not letting that be a barrier to entry for that next generation. I know, you know, Heather and Cheryl were talking in the chat a little bit about the way that these issues have kind of remained the same for many generations, and that can be very discouraging. So I think that it's worth thinking about the ways that the discourse is or is not evolving, the responsibilities of the players in the conversation are or are not changing, and how that then shapes the way the next generation sees opportunities in this field. So I'm definitely going to be thinking about that after this conversation, and thanks to my colleagues for bringing that up.
That's a very important point. Nomza, what are your reflections on this conversation and takeaways for the future?
Well, since you're recording, I won't sing the whole song, The Room Where It Happens, from the Hamilton soundtrack, but I think about it all the time when confronted with these issues, to think, first of all, you have to be in the room where it happens, where the decision making is being made. And in order to get there, we're going to have to lift as we climb. So I collated a bit of a few Twitter handles that I'm going to drop in the chat to recommend people follow, so that I can recommend some people and some organizations that folks can follow. And then from there, you can start to, you know, everyone can do their part in this 21st century world we live in, where you can literally retweet somebody's work and help increase visibility. I would encourage all the panelists as well to put their Twitter handles in the chat, so that, you know, we can get some more diverse opinions out there and being promoted and being circulated. So that's basically that's my parting shot, is to say, other Hamilton. You can tell what I was listening to this morning. But yeah,
I was certainly.
Let's work towards being in the room where it happens, where the decision making happens, and be creative about ways to help others get there, and for you to be there too.
Lift as we climb and lift each other up as we climb, right? Very well said. Jenny?
Sure, and you know, this really echoes what Nomza just said also in terms of, you know, I think we need to be careful not to mistake representation with equity. And so in this process, it's one thing to be in the room, but are you really participating? Is the room really conducive to your participation? And so I think, you know, this really ties together a lot of what all the speakers have talked about today, is that with the biases that exist, with the burden of being the only woman in the room, I think there has to be great mentorship, as Sylvia was talking about, horizontal mentorship, vertical mentorship, really encouraging that participation, and recognizing when that respect isn't there, when the environment isn't conducive to participation as well, and trying to correct for that. And so that, this isn't just a woman problem, this is a whole diversity problem, right? So whenever you see that environment is not conducive to broad participation, adjustments have to be made. And I think the more we recognize that, the farther we'll advance.
Very well said. And last, but certainly not the least, Heather, you started us off, you conclude us all.
Well, now I have the challenge that Sarah had before. And so in order not to repeat any of the really wise things that have been said, the point I'll add is that it's so tempting for us to think this is a technical problem internal to the field and that we can just assemble the right data and the right, Twitter validators. But because, and as you've noted, Mariana, in your very subtle leadership of this conversation, the closer you get to the kind of white hot heart of controlling who lives and who dies, the more we get to these really deep ideas around the gendered nature of security and who provides it. So this, the lesson I take from what we have managed to change over recent years and my whole career and what we haven't is that we're not ultimately going to be able to sever progress in this field from progress in societies more broadly.
Thank you so much. And thank you all. We're right on the mark. It's 3 o'clock. Thank you so much for coming out, for sacrificing a nice Friday afternoon to talk about this very important issue. I hope this is not the last time we convene and try and take this topic forward. And I wish you all the very best of luck with all of the important endeavors in your careers, in your lives, and in making this field a more productive and a more diverse one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us, and thanks to everyone who spent their time with us.
Thanks, everyone.
The hardcore group is still with us. But no, I really do appreciate this conversation, and it will be recorded, and we'll send around a link so all of you can share it on your Twitter accounts and so forth. All right, enjoy your Friday afternoon, and thank you again. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.